those of you who don't know about Conservation 50, Conservation 50 was set up last year to celebrate 50 years of the first conservation area in St Albans. We did celebrate. We had a conference, an exhibition, a schools competition. And when we finished with that, we realized that, of course, conservation of the environment goes on. The built environment, it goes on. And so we're carrying on. And so my talk this evening is partly to help fund that. The things that we're looking at, particularly important now because of the pandemic crisis we've had, is the city centre vision. And we're also looking at getting some more blue plaques up in St Albans, which are badly needed. And we're thinking about how we can put together a conservation area advisory committee to help with conservation throughout the city and district. So thank you again for giving up a lovely sunny evening and being here coping with Zoom. Right, now I think we'll start with the first, before I go to the first slide, what I should say is I heard in the chatter that someone said, what is that first slide? And you saw a devilish face. Well, the devilish face is a detail from Michelangelo's Last Judgment on the east wall of the Sistine Chapel. And when you go back and have a look at it, have a look at the boatman swinging his oar to send people merrily down into hell. And that was the character. So why the nature of evil tonight? You might well ask. Well, I'm an anthropologist, and anthropologists are very interested in behavior, human behavior, and evil, of course, is at the extreme end of human behavior. And why the cathedral, someone said? Isn't that a rather risky subject for the cathedral? Well, of course, theologians are very interested in evil. They're interested not in the human behavior so much as in the behavior of God and why God allows evil to exist. And I will come on to that later in my talk. So let's get underway. Now, I did a part of a talk about art for Conservation 50. It was all about my bit was about the pre-Raphaelites, but it was about really looking at the arts and crafts movement. And after that talk, I sat down with Caroline and we talked about what we might do next. And I came up with this idea of evil, and you'll see why I came up with it. And I thought the nature of evil is something that's going to be of interest to people because it is such an odd and extreme element of human behavior. So let's start. If I can have the next slide, please, Caroline. And I've been given control. Here we go. I'm now in control. Now, I don't know if any of you have heard of this character. I hadn't. I think you have to be under a certain age and be listening to rap. But what you're looking at now is someone called George the Poet, George Mapanga. He's a rapper and a broadcast host. And though he was born in Neasden, he actually came from Uganda, as you can see on the map there in Africa. And he was offered last year, in 2019, the honour of member of the British Empire. And he rejected it. Now, lots of people reject it, but he rejected it in quite a stern and harsh way, which made people gasp. He said the British Empire was pure evil. And then, and this is quite a sort of astounding metaphor in a way, he said, your forefathers raped my motherland, pinned her down and took turns. Whew, pretty tough language. But it got me to think about evil and why it is such a difficult subject to deal with because of its extremeness. Now, of course, since then, all sorts of things have happened. The most important being the pandemic, coronavirus. And coronavirus, of course, is the reason why this isn't a talk actually happening at the cathedral, but you're on Zoom. But coronavirus, seeing if I can get the technology to work. I think I'm going to have to go back to Caroline. It didn't want to work for me, Caroline. I wonder if you could get me into the next slide. I'll try again. And there we are. We've got there. Good. Coronavirus is a natural evil that's hit us. And one of our Church of England vicars actually pronounced it as a profound evil. So if you're thinking about evil, there are basically two sorts of evil. They are the evil that is inflicted upon us as human beings, and then there's the evil we inflict on others. If I could go back to the next slide, Caroline. Have you? No, it's back. Shall I try again?
Yeah, if you tell me when to go to and from the slides, I think it's obviously not enjoying me giving you.
No, I need just to go back to one more slide. Back the other way. That's it. Thank you. Sorry, folks, about these technological difficulties, but they happen even when you're on site and not having to cope with Zoom. So natural evils. Here's just this is a list of the things: floods, earthquakes, lightning, famine, forest fires, tsunamis, hurricanes, drought, disease, all sorts of things that happen to us. And of course, I've already mentioned coronavirus, a disease which we're having to cope with. Is it an evil? Well, it can be classified, as I say, by an evil by some people. Next one, please. And we'll just whiz through the next one because that's the coronavirus, and on to the next one. So, yes, who do we blame for the evils of the world, the natural evils that hit us? Well, on your screen, you'll see up there a demon from the Book of Wonders, an Arabic manuscript from the 14th century. So demons were possibly causing all these evil things. But as we moved into the more scientific age and the more skeptical age, we saw as other people being responsible. The most popular one, of course, is the one down in the bottom left-hand corner, government. Government causes all these troubles, or it doesn't deal with them. And it's quite interesting now in terms of the blame game. Who do we blame for the pandemic, or at least our failure to deal with it in the way we would like to deal with it, and so on. Then, of course, there's big business right in the middle. Big business is, we can blame big business for a lot of evils and things because they're just about profit and money and so on. And then if you're a James Bond follower. Oh, I think I've lost a slide up there. I need to just go. That's it. If we go back, there we are, and then forward again. Sorry about this. That's it. There we are. And then if you follow the sort of movies and the novels, you have these megalomaniac, crazy people, as in James Bond, Dr. No, perhaps being the most famous, who wants to destroy the world and is evil. And I think the theme in James Bond movies, I can't remember how many they've made now, there's always some evil person in there, some terrible person who we classify as evil. So we've got lots of these natural evils, but they're also human evils, like Dr. No. So let's have a look at some human evils. Next slide, please. Well, what we're trying to do is get rid of those evils. And in the ancient world, the evils were seen as coming from the supernatural. And what we had to do was appease the gods. What could we do to appease the gods? And sacrifice was pretty predominant amongst many societies, even pre-literate societies, i.e. those that didn't have a history, believed in some sort of sacrifice to a supernatural power. It's the reciprocity of a gift. I give you a gift, you give me a gift back, I give a gift to the supernatural power, the gods, and they give me a gift back, which is they get rid of that arbitrary evil, whatever it is, famine, water shortage, whatever's happening. Now we know in the ancient world that the greatest gift, of course, was the sacrifice of life. And the Carthaginians, we know, sacrificed young children. And there's a mention of it, as you will know in the Bible, of course, in Egypt, of the sacrifice of the firstborn. Now, this is a bit of archaeological evidence here from Carthage in North Africa, and it's what's called a tophet. And you can see what are called stelae, those blocks of stones covered by a later Roman vault. But those blocks of stones were where young children, babies, were sacrificed to the gods to bring good fortune to Carthage. The Romans believed also in sacrifice, as the Greeks did, but they'd moved really from human sacrifice to animal sacrifice. And what you've got down there is a stone relief, a marble relief from the altar of peace, the Ara Pacis in Rome, which Augustus had dedicated to him in 9 BC. And what you can see are the 3 traditional beasts of sacrifice. There's the pig right up by the priest who's about to sacrifice, then you've got the sheep, and then you've got the bull. So appease your gods. Next slide, please. Well, the Abrahamic religions, and what I mean by the Abrahamic, and most of you will know this, but it's Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, were quite different in their approach to natural disasters, because being monotheistic, they saw them, meaning one God, they came from one God, and one God told them how to behave, that one God. And it was written down, so it was a law. And if you trespassed against the law, you broke the law, then God would punish you. And the Old Testament, many of you will be familiar with, is full of the Hebrews being punished by God for stepping out of line, disobeying the commandments. And Judaism is a very legal religion. In the same way, Christianity adopted this in a rather looser fashion, because it told you how to behave, but rather more generally without being prescriptive. It didn't say that you couldn't eat shellfish or you couldn't eat pork, but it did lay down how you should behave towards your neighbor and so on. So Christians felt that if they behaved, or misbehaved, I should say, they might receive the wrath of God, though this became as a very important theological point, which we'll come on to later. And the same is, of course, true of Islam, because Muhammad wrote it all down. There it is. It's all written down, the word of God. Of course, we know sometimes it's a bit ambiguous and you have to interpret it and so on. But the idea was that there was a holy law that you didn't disobey, and that protected you from the natural evils. But I mentioned earlier, of course, that there are also human evils, those evils committed by human beings. Next slide, please. So where does this idea of evil come from? What is the origins of the term? Well, we know that the Old English was evil, and this we think is derived from the Old German. The root is a bit obscure, and linguists don't quite know, but they suggest, and it seems quite probable, that it may come from the German über, with the idea of going over the top, excess. So in your spectrum, from good to bad, evil is right at the end of that spectrum. Now, evil prior to the 16th century was quite a weak word, really just the equivalent of bad. But during all the religious controversies and conflicts that grew in the 16th century, it started to take on a much more sinister and powerful meaning. And theologians used the word to cast really doubt and opprobrium upon their fellow clerics who didn't agree with their views. So, of course, Catholics and Protestants were calling each other evil quite willy-nilly. Now, in terms of actually what it's come to mean, I've chosen to pick up from the American philosopher Marcus Singer. And he said, the word evil is the worst possible term of opprobrium. If you call someone evil, you're really putting them outside the normal human behavior. And you're suggesting in some cases that they're not really human at all. Next slide, please. How's the slides doing? Ah, there we are. Now, I'm afraid from now on, it all gets pretty nasty, and I must warn you, there's some really horrible things I'm going to talk about. Human evils, what we are capable of doing. Genocide. Up on the left there is the Armenian genocide. Figures for this are not absolutely clear, but Armenians and their historians will say 1.5 million were massacred or marched to their deaths in Syria by the Ottoman regime. And even the Turkish journalists recognize this, though the Turkish government won't recognize it. And it's an ongoing battle to get the Armenian genocide recognized. Turkey refuses to recognize it as a genocide. And so this particular journalist, Cengiz Akar, took a huge risk when he wrote an article that actually said the Armenian genocide is Turkey's founding evil. And what he meant by that was, of course, the Republic of Turkey having got rid of the Sultan and the Ottoman Empire having collapsed. Over on your right, you've got Anders Behring Breivik. In 2011, went on an island where young people, young socialist people, were having a gathering and opened fire with a gun, having previously also killed some people in Oslo before he went. Totally unrepentant, there doing the Nazi salute. As a right-wing extremist, he felt he was ridding the world of inhuman, unhuman people he didn't agree with. As I say, he's totally unrepentant. What do you do with someone like that? How can they perceive killing young people because you don't agree with their views as possibly legitimate human behavior? And then, of course, very much with us still today, as it goes on, dozens of Syrians dying in a war, and we know there's enough evidence to show that they've often used chemical weapons. Here is a tragic picture of young children who have been killed by a chemical attack just in the suburb of Damascus. And this is a journalist quote: "The Assad regime has committed horrible acts of evil." So I'm afraid as a species, we are able to, this extreme behavior of committing evil. And it gets worse. Next slide, please. Now, some of you will have watched the series The Silent Witness on the BBC. It's been running for years and years now, and it's about pathologists doing things that probably pathologists don't normally do, which is investigating crimes and usually finding out who has done it and solving the problem. But I was struck, I was listening to, or watching, I should say, one of the episodes, and this was a couple of years ago, and the character Nikki Alexander, who's played by the actress Amelia Fox, was faced with the killing and the rape of a child. And the writer, someone called Tim Prager, put this line in: "It is so evil, it is like an infectious disease. There is no cure for it." And I thought that was really interesting, because there's this analogy between an infectious disease, we might say coronavirus, as being evil, and human behavior being evil. And if we're thinking about the worst evil, we are really probably in our minds now, and you will guess where we're going, we're talking about children being killed. We saw that with the chemical bombing in Damascus. We see it here as a fictional thing, but the World Health Organization published this report last year, which is quite shocking when you think about it, that it estimates globally that up to 1 billion children, and the population of the planet is 7 billion, remember, aged between 2 and 17, have experienced physical, sexual, or emotional violence or neglect in the past year. Well, this is my talk tonight isn't here to explain why children are so often the victims. That's perhaps a talk somewhere else, but that requires not just a bit of anthropology, but I think some psychology as well. Next slide, please. The nation was totally shocked by what you're seeing now. The famous, infamous Bulger case. Children who are killed by child killers. This is so extreme. But on the 12th of February in 1993, James, wrongly called by the press Jamie Bulger, was abducted from a shopping centre in Kirby. You probably even saw the video, near Liverpool. And then the awful bit comes next. Taken to a railway line, tortured, beaten to death by 2 10-year-old boys, John Venables and Robert Thompson. One of the detectives interviewing one of the suspects at the time came out with this statement, which was printed in the press, which of course should never have been allowed, but nevertheless, he said one of the suspects knew he was evil. 10-year-old child knowing he was evil. Next slide, thank you. Oh, you've jumped one, sorry, if you could go back. And it doesn't get any better, I'm afraid. You will also remember the awful case of baby P, a toddler so brutally physically abused that he had over 50 injuries inflicted upon him in 8 months by his mother and her boyfriend, Tracy Connolly and Stephen Parker. and also the brother, Jason Owen. They were all convicted. He died, that is, poor old Peter Connolly died on the 3rd of August 2007. And the media, and particularly the red tops, the popular media, of course, had a field day. And here's Tom Wells in The Sun labelling Tracy Connolly as an evil mum. Now, the power of this is quite exceptional because, of course, we associate motherhood and mums with loving, caring, they bring us up. We're all indebted to our mothers, and generally we all love our mothers because they are so important in our lives and gave us life. And here's the juxtaposition of evil with mum, a pretty damning headline, and one to catch attention. Next slide, please. And the argument then moved into a nature-nurture one. This is a really interesting passage, and I will read it all out because it was written by Sue Carroll on the 18th of November, 2006 in the Daily Mirror. And the headline was, "Don't make excuses for evil child killers." Doubtless, social anthropologists, guilty, criminologists and assaulted psychiatrists will spend hours shuffling through court papers and reports in an attempt to shed some light on what motivated these monsters. Already, they're not humans, they're monsters, to kill innocent and vulnerable children. Innocent and vulnerable. That's what children are. They will explain that appalling childhoods, parental neglect, and feelings of inadequacy forged within each of them the need to empower themselves. Society itself will almost certainly be found wanting and therefore somehow to blame. It's our fault. That some kids are born bad, inherently evil, and with a predetermined killer gene will not, however, be a consideration. I have to say, looking at the facts presented to the Manchester Crown Court, it is hard to understand why we shy away from the concept that, tragically, humanity occasionally throws up a wrong one, bizarre ending, throws up a wrong one. This is the nurture argument. Is it within our genes? Is it about nature? Are we born with particular behavioral patterns? Are we born evil? Are we born good? Or is it really our upbringing, the environment, the culture in which we exist that has shaped human beings to behave in these extreme ways? I think my position as an anthropologist would be on this, and you won't be perhaps surprised to hear that it's going to be a bit of both. There are some genetic predispositions. We do know, particularly, of course, now in medical science, we know about diseases where there's a predisposition for a particular illness, but a predisposition doesn't mean that it's automatically going to happen. And often it is the culture and the environment, and it may be down to even with diseases, things like diet. For example, it's astonishing to read in the papers today that 1/3 of people who have died from COVID-19 were diabetics. Diabetes has undoubtedly caused all sorts of problems, and with that goes obesity and other physical difficulties, and particularly anything to do with the heart or the respiratory organs has created mayhem for those who are suffering from coronavirus. Next slide, please. So what's the source of human evil and wickedness? Well, what we're looking at now is here a group of witches, and they're offering wax effigies of the devil. It's a 17th century woodcut, and of course it's astonishing to think that people could be labeled, and elderly women, single women left in the village, in the community, were picked out as being the source of evil and evil behavior. Those who were evil were not merely bad, but they exhibited extreme moral wickedness. The word wickedness itself is derived from the Old English vice, meaning a witch. So the association of evil people was with the supernatural embodying evil within a human subject. Poor old witches. Next slide, please. And now we move more to the religious side, because, okay, we know in the Old Testament that there are devils, and Michael has cast out the rebellious angels. And this is an illustration by Gustave Doré of Milton's Paradise Lost. And there, those fallen angels crashing through space. But we have a loving and omnipotent God who's omnipresent everywhere, who has total power. So this God, and here's an image of God the Father by Cima da Conigliani. What role has God in allowing evil to exist in this world when he loves us and he's all powerful and he sees everything? Next slide, please. And that leads us to a theological dilemma, the dilemma of theodicy, which in Greek means the justice of God. And who's to blame for evil in the world? Now, on the left, you've got there our earliest known portrait of St Augustine of Hippo, Hippo is in North Africa, and St Augustine was the bishop there for many, many years, a prolific writer and very important for the early church, writing in Latin. And he pondered this problem, the problem of why there is evil in the world when we know we have an all-powerful, loving God. Why does he allow it? And St. Augustine came to the conclusion it cannot be God. God is not evil, cannot create evil. It has to be something we human beings do that has created evil. And this is when the concept of original sin was fully developed. It wasn't totally St. Augustine's idea. Paul had already touched on it, but St. Augustine, in a sense, polished it up and presented it as the real reason why humans can behave in an evil way. And what it is it's the sin of Adam and Eve, which is passed down to all of us, passed down by concupiscence, the sexual act. So we inherit it. One of his proofs of this, which is of course amusing, was that he realized that babies cried. And he didn't understand why babies were crying, and there seemed to be no particular reason. So that was the earliest manifestation that they, of course, embodied evil. Well, we might dismiss that as rather naive and odd. But I wrote a whole paper about St. Augustine and evil. And when I wrote it, I was pretty against St. Augustine, I have to say. I was pretty, how dare he? However, since then, I do realize, and I suppose it's happened with science and genetics, that actually we do inherit things from our mother and father which we wouldn't like, whether they're damaged genes which leave us vulnerable to certain illnesses, or whether it's behavioral patterns, human behavioral patterns. We do inherit those things. And of course, as an anthropologist, I understand that when we were back in our earlier existence, even as early Homo sapiens, it was a fight for survival, and we were very competitive and very ruthless. And if we compare our behavior, maybe, and I know that one of you is really keen for me to mention this, if we compare our behavior with chimpanzees or even bonobos, we will know that they can be pretty aggressive and difficult. Now, what you're seeing there is this lovely cleaned up painting from the Braccacci Chapel, Masaccio's fresco of the expulsion, poor old Adam and Eve being thrown out. So original sin, in a way, traces that back, all that bad behavior and evil back to Adam and Eve. It's a tough legacy. Next slide, please. But as Christianity developed and moved on, it was recognized that this was quite tricky to inherit evil without us having any way of combating it. And it was Aquinas who mulled over basically St. Augustine's view of it and said, I understand where St. Augustine's coming from, but this can't be the real reason. The real reason is that we're quite tricky species and we have this free will which God gave us, a great gift. to be able to think and make judgments on our own. But there is a negative side that goes with free will, which is we can behave badly and we can actually then commit evil acts. And evil comes into the world again through humanity, but through our behavior, not inherited specifically in original sin. And this is a rather nice politic of Thomas Aquinas. It's a detail and is by Gentili di Fabriano, as you can see there, 14th century. There he is studying his book. Next slide, please. Well, as we moved into the more scientific world and the age of enlightenment, there were concerns amongst the theologians that this idea of original sin and then free will, and somehow or other we were guilty, a guilty party, always guilty, concerned this particular mathematician. Well, he was a polymath, really, Blaise Pascal. And he tried to get at the root of what Christianity was all about. And he felt, yes, we as a species, and of course he didn't know about evolution at that time, but he saw us as part of the kingdom, the animal kingdom of the world. We as a species are inevitably corrupted, but it is the redemption of Jesus that saves us. And that's the bit we should focus on, that we may, in a sense, be corrupt, but we can be saved from evil behavior by that redemption. And those who embrace Christ will be saved and will not commit evil. So particularly, of course, in the Catholic Church, it became very important to have your sins absolved, any corruption absolved, so that you could pass on to heaven. I always loved this story, and it's a bit apocryphal. We don't really know whether it actually happened, and the source is untraceable. But it's said that when Voltaire, great writer, thinker, dramatist, was lying on his deathbed, the priest came to him and said, "Voltaire, you're dying. Will you now renounce the devil and all his evil works?" And Voltaire was supposed to have replied, well, at this stage, I don't think so, because I don't want to make any new enemies. I think it's quite amusing. Anyway, on to the next slide, please. But with the age of science, we moved away, in a sense, from religious explanations of evil to trying to understand human behavior. And of course, it starts with Darwin, understanding us as a evolutionary species. We start the more primitive background and we evolve. And he brought into the notion of evolution the idea of progress, that we as human beings get better and better. Well, I think that's often quite arguable. Certainly, of course, in terms of technology, we've advanced enormously, and the modern world is very, very different from our ancestors who first came into Europe round about 160,000 years ago. So things have changed a lot. Whether that is moral progress is quite debatable, but certainly technological progress is undoubtedly true. But then if we move across the slide to Sigmund Freud, we start seeing the science of psychology and psychoanalysis being developed. So it's a concentration then on the human mind and what is going on in the human mind that can make it so perverted that it commits acts of evil. The moral self was the conscious, but evil self lies in the unconscious. That in some ways the evil that people commit is not because they're conscious of it, because they're unconscious of it. And of course you might see this, well, let's take an analogy. A lot of modern crime, and particularly violent crime, is committed in the name of people searching for or under the influence of money and drugs. And of course, under alcohol, a lot of violence takes place, a lot of abuse takes place. So it's as if the conscious mind has lost control. and the unconscious has taken over. Now, Freud saw this as an explanation of the evil, but it didn't in a way embrace the whole of the world's view. It embraced a particular individual. His successor, if we can call him that, his colleague, once friend, and then unfortunately not exactly an enemy, but they fell out. If I could have the next slide, was Carl Jung. And Jung saw the unconscious, yes, as a source of problematic behavior and of a lack of understanding of the self. But he also said that this embraced the whole of society and the whole of the supernatural, and that in fact God had an element of evil in him. Quite a tricky thing to say. And if you want to see how he approaches this, you have a look at his answer to Job. He takes Job and says, how could God have inflicted all of this on Job as a test to see if he would be loyal? It doesn't make any sense. But he sees God and human beings made in the image of God as having that potential for evil behavior. And I put on the Star Wars, Darth Vader from Star Wars, because it's very interesting that Lucas picks this theme up, and the dark side is a constant theme running through the Star Wars films. And perhaps the most interesting one, I think, is the second one, where the Empire Strikes Back, and you actually find Luke Skywalker, confronting his enemy, fighting his enemy, Darth Vader, to discover that, of course, Darth Vader is his father. And there you might well say there's an interesting bit of father and son and how you pass on your behavior. So for Jung, it was the whole of our universe, conceptually, which contained the Almighty and human beings, which was impregnated with evil within the unconscious. And he came up with this very interesting idea of the shadow. Some of you will know about the shadow. The idea was with this that there are bits of us that we don't like, and we repress it, and we put it and push it down into the unconscious. And we can only get at it by trying to understand what causes us pain and a problem. Now, I remember as a student playing this game, and I don't know if some of you played this game, where you sit in a group and people don't know about Carl Jung and they don't know about the shadow. So you then say to them, right, what is the thing that you hate most of all in human behavior, people's behavior, what you don't like? And I remember saying, I really don't like fanatics. And then what is explained to me that this is part of me pushed down into my unconscious. I had to admit, I could see that I could be fanatical. It was true. So the shadow game is a very interesting one. Think of the things that you really don't like and see if that's a part of you that you are repressing. Well, I've got a bit personal now. On to the next slide. So how do we explain the psychopath, evil and psychopathy? And of course, all our entertainment is full of it. And the fascination that people have with serial killers and what's gone wrong. Because somehow or other, it is outside normal behavior to have this psychopathy, evil, manifest in an ordinary human being. Roy Baumeister, who wrote about evil, and he wrote Inside Human Violence and Cruelty, I think this quote sums up really very well the idea of what a psychopath is. An evil person is one who intentionally inflicts serious physical harm on another person or persons in pursuit of a personal, ideological, or religious goal, and who experiences intense psychological pleasure in doing so. And I guess we think of evil acts now, whether it's terrorism, murder, serial killing, torture. There are those individuals who seem to be able to put aside normal behavior. Are they ill? Or are they, as the Mirror said, Carol Lewis said, are they just born evil and there's nothing we can do about it? Well, let's look at that as a moral position now. Next slide, please. If it's nature, then we are biologically determined. Here is the warrior gene identified, which could cause psychopathy. There's the normal brain, and there's the psychopathic brain. And as you'll see, the orbital cortex of the hypofrontality is quite different. What has happened? It is useful to think of psychopathy as mainly the product of genes, or is sociopathy as a more subject to environmental influences? Is a psychopath necessarily going to carry out an evil deed? Because psychopaths can be defined, medically defined, as perhaps not having any empathy, of only being able to think about themselves, of being able to act in a particular way, so that people are not aware that they're psychopaths. But does it necessarily mean, because it's biologically determined, they're going to carry out evil acts and become a sociopath? Next slide, please. If we take a moral position on this, we could consider Plato and Kant, who will say, everybody knows, because it is a universal, there is good and bad. There is good behavior, there's bad behavior, and it is a moral absolute, a categorical imperative, which applies to moral agents independently of facts about their own goals and desires. It doesn't matter who you are or what you feel or what. This is quite clear. There is a spectrum, and you do not step over into the evil world. What he was picking up on there was, of course, Plato, whose idea that there was an idea itself, the idea of an ideal which represent right and wrong. And therefore, human beings should be able to respect that absolutism. Well, anthropologists recognize that there are lots of different cultures, and those cultures don't necessarily have the same rules. They don't have the same attitude or view on life. Next slide, please. And that's moral relativism. Herodotus, who, as an early Greek writer, was seen as the father of history, writing back there in the 5th century BC, recognized, and although he was a historian, he was quite an anthropologist, he recognized that we judge in an ethnocentric way other societies' behavior. What he meant was, we make the judgment based on our own values. So we judge other societies and say, they shouldn't do this, they shouldn't do the other. And of course, we know that when missionaries went out to many societies, they imposed the Christian values of the Western world because they saw those as absolute. Now, was that right? Or should they have had more respect for the customs and the practices of other ethnic groups? Spinoza, the Dutch philosopher, began thinking about the different way people see the world. And as he said, in terms of, as far as good and evil are concerned, they also indicate nothing positive in things considered in themselves, nor are they anything other than modes of thinking or notions we form because we compare things one to another. In other words, we only recognize certain behaviors because it's a comparative exercise between good, bad, and evil. And it's just part of an overall spectrum which we determine one position or the other. Subjectivity, in other words, we're quite subjective. So that's quite an extreme view, which would suggest that if you're a headhunter in North Borneo and you send young men out to kill and behead and bring back those heads of trophies of a neighboring tribe, that is perfectly morally legitimate, because that is relative within your culture and you should be able to act that way. Next slide, please. The extreme of this, in a way, is amoralism, where there is no morality. And as Thomas Hobbes was the great conveyor of this idea, nothing is right, nothing is wrong. The idea of evil has no value, but is merely a construct. It's merely what we want to throw at other people we don't like, or their behavior they don't like. Somehow or other, there is no moral absolutism within a society on which anything is based, other than people who have the power and decide what is right and wrong. And then, of course, Nietzsche saw this again as an extreme. But whatsoever is the object of any man's appetite or desire, it is within, for his part, what he calls good, and the object of his hate and aversion he calls evil. So the things we like, we say are good, we're happy with those. The things we don't like, we say are wrong or evil, which of course in a way reflects some of the things that the theologians, the clerics, were throwing at each other in the 16th century when there was so much religious turmoil. What you do, you label the other side as evil. And we know from the propaganda of wars, and I'm thinking particularly of the First World War, the propaganda thinks about evil acts so that it can call the other side evil. So we know that there was a lot of misleading journalism about, for example, the Germans' invasion of Belgium, where babies were being bayoneted and eaten and so on, so that we could label them, the Germans, the Boche, as evil because of their behavior. Next slide, please. So what about evil, where there seems to be no motive at all? What is that about? Is it the pleasure of the person committing that act? Is that going back to being a psychopath, that they are gaining pleasure from hurting someone else? Is it the power? What is it? Coleridge was very interested in Iago in Shakespeare's Othello, because he saw evil there as something that really you couldn't explain. It didn't have a real motive. It was so within the individual that it was not explanatory. Now, some of you who will know Othello will disagree, because Iago, of course, was passed over in terms of power. He was jealous sexually and so on. So perhaps Coleridge's example, motiveless evil, wasn't such a good example, but you get the idea that somehow or other, it just doesn't seem that there's a cause, that people just behave in this way, and it's perhaps so deep within their psyche we can't understand it. Next slide, please. Now, some of you may know about Terry Eagleton. Terry Eagleton is a very interesting academic, but an odd academic in the sense that he is a Roman Catholic and a communist. And he wrote a book back in 2010 on evil. And I think his own position, his own dilemma, made him create two categories. And you can see here, he wrote and said, Hitler was evil, but Stalin was wicked, and Mao Zedong was wicked. And the reason he gives is, which doesn't really hold up, but anyway, this is his argument. Hitler carried out genocide, torture, cruelty, extermination, etc., with no real motive. Whereas Stalin, of course, did have a motive for sending people to the Gulag, for assassinating Polish intellectuals and generals, and generally murdering his own people and starving his own people and so on, because he had a motive to stay in power. And he carried on the same argument for Mao Zedong. I have to say, just don't think it works. I don't think we can categorize separate that category of evil and wicked. To my mind, if we apply Western morality, which is based on Christianity and based on science and enlightenment, we would say that these characters, all these political leaders, carried within them extreme behavior which we might classify as evil and goes beyond what would be normal in any other human being. The paradox is, of course, and the problem is, how do they get into power and why do people go along with them? Next slide, please. And this leads me to Hannah Arendt's really amazing conclusion, but seems to be so full of truth, the banality of evil. She went to the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who you may remember was captured by the Israeli Secret Service and taken back to Israel for trial. And of course, his defense was, I was just carrying out orders. And he just carried out orders, as if he had no moral agency himself at all. He just had to do as he was told. Well, undoubtedly, of course, there would have been huge leverage on all people who served the Nazi regime. And perhaps that's the explanation of how these dictators come to power and how they're able to maintain power by inflicting that leverage, pulling that leverage on the people and those who serve them. So Eichmann, an Austrian sent to look after concentration camp, just carried out orders exterminating Jews and enemies of society, of German society, that Hitler didn't like. Hannah Arendt said, under conditions of terror, most people would comply. And I'm afraid that's true. And often, you know, the puzzle is put up, the dilemma is put up. What if Hitler had conquered Britain? How would we have behaved? And of course, we know from the behavior in France that many people did comply. And we know from the behavior in Norway that many people complied, the Quislings, as they were called. So under that sort of leverage, it's very difficult. Your family's threatened, your life is threatened, you will carry out orders. But some people will not. No more is required and no more can reasonably be asked for this planet to remain a place fit for human habitation. And there will be those brave people who usually lose their lives, of course, for standing up against the psychopaths, the bullies, the evil leaders of this world. Next slide, please. But strangely, like many things in life, there is an attraction of evil. And I actually saw last year, when I was walking in St Peter's Street in St Albans, a girl with a t-shirt which said "Wicked" on it. And as you can see from this, 2 t-shirts, evil, wicked. And as the French philosopher Simone Weil said, imaginary evil is romantic and varied. Young people use the term wicked or evil as to mean something that's good, not something that's bad. So there's this odd attraction that human beings have for the dark side, the Darth Vader side, the unconscious side, perhaps, in their psyche, which makes them think that there's something attractive about it. It's not that they really want to carry it out. It's just, it's an extreme piece of behavior, which means they're not conforming and they have that element in them, which may relate to a whole series of thoughts, ideas, fantasies, things they've seen perhaps in media, which they empathize with, but wouldn't necessarily carry out. It's true that Nazi Germany is still incredibly popular in terms of its history. More books are sold on Nazi Germany every year than any other history book. And university courses, the courses that, or modules that students like to sign up for, as Nazi Germany. So there's a bit in us that wants to get close to it, to understand it, to unravel it, and almost take pleasure in that extreme element of behavior. It explains the popularity of serial killers and how they're followed, and the number of hits on Google following murders and violent deaths is much higher than other areas. Oh, not during the pandemic, by the way. During the pandemic, it's mainly recipes. Next slide, please. But we mustn't get into a moral panic about it. Some of you will remember this. Back in the 1970s and 80s, there was concern about satanic ritual abuse. It was said to have taken place in Cleveland, Rochdale, Broxtown, and one that I was particularly involved and interested in was Lewis on the Orkney Islands. And the reason why I became involved in that was because one of my teachers at the London School of Economics was Jean Lafontaine, an anthropologist, well-known anthropologist. And when this whole thing of satanic abuse blew up, the government commissioned her to write a report to find out what was really going on. And the report is available. Actually, you can get it on the internet. Speak of the Devil. She examined very forensically 84 cases of so-called ritual abuse and found absolutely no evidence of satanic abuse. The Orkney case was very tragic because some of the children were taken away to the mainland of Scotland and didn't return for almost a decade back to their parents, based on false allegations. It was just that moral panic. And we do sometimes create that moral panic, that we see things and elaborate on them, which are not really there. And certainly there's been no evidence of satanic abuse going on in these islands. Next slide, please. Well, I'm coming to the end now of my talk, and I've sort of posed this as a dilemma. How evil are you? How evil are your thoughts? And I'm sure that none of you attending this Zoom webinar could possibly be evil, but there's a serious point to this in a sense, that we all have a bit of a dark side, and it goes back to Jung's, I think, very clever and interesting explanation of that unconscious element of us, the shadow, the bit that we don't necessarily want to own up to. But the point I really want to make, and this is where I'm so in disagreement with Carol Lewis of the Mirror and all of those who say people are born evil and it's so awful we just have to forget them and not worry about them. I think we actually need to do more studies and more investigations, and we need to understand more about evil and our responses to them, and how we can manage evil and we can control evil, and that will make the planet a better place rather than an evil place. Last slide, please. Thank you very much.
I'm going to unmute everybody for a round of applause. Thank you, Tim.
I have to say, it's very strange talking into a vacuum.